the Historyogi Podcast. This is Dave. Most of us are familiar with famous intelligence agencies such as the American CIA, the British MI6, and Israel's Mossad. But did you know Singapore has its own spy agency known as the Security and Intelligence Division? Its first chief was Tay Seow Huah, who helped build Singapore's early intelligence capabilities during the height of the Cold War and was involved in handling the Laju terrorist incident. Today, we speak to his son, Dr Simon Tay, chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, about his new book, Enigmas, which describes his father's life and unusual career. So thanks very much, Prof. Tay, for joining us today. To start off, what inspired you to write this book about your father?
Well, Deb, I think my father died a long time ago, 1980s. So you're right. Why in 2020-something did I start to write about him? I think there are personal reasons. One, I'm 63 now, and I start to see the end of my own life, active life. And I've got to figure out what I really need to get done and do them. So one of them on that list, in that sense, is a debt I think I owe my father to think about him. And then, since I am a writer, it ended up as a book. The second is opportunistic. There was this thing called the global pandemic. So we were all, shut in. There was less office time, travel time, less overseas travel. So my life opened up hours, and I thought how to use them, thoughtfully, productively. I didn't buy a stationary bicycle like many people did. So I thought this was one way to use the time productively. But I'm glad I did, because I feel first, many of the themes of his work, the security problems, the political problems of that 1960s, 70s period, are echoing in the present day times. And secondly, of course, there is in Singapore now a much deeper recognition of what we owe to the pioneers. And this will be the start of the commissioning of the Founders Memorial, and the number of books about political leaders, about senior civil servants, about business tycoons. All that has not quite mushroomed, but certainly grown in number over the last decade. So I think in terms of my personal, political, as well as Singapore's place, it's timely, I hope.
How did you conduct research for the book given the sensitive nature of his job?
I think I approached this from the fact that I am not a historian. I am a son, his son. So in this sense, what were my special strengths I could bring to a project like this was my own personal memories as a child until about 18, 19 when he passed on. And then also the ability I have to write. I write fiction. I also, as a sort of international lawyer and analyst, I do deal with facts. So I was quite comfortable to sieve facts and also to sort of draw theories or extrapolate from the facts that are known. I did not try at all to really do hard historical work, like keep knocking on the door of the Ministry of Defense or the internal security people to release documents. I think that's quite foolhardy. The rules, you may not agree with them, but they are not going to make exception for one guy and his son. I was lucky in the sense that there are some people who still knew about him, and some people I know who could see the sort of fingerprints I think that his work has left. And also, I think some of his work, though it's very secretive, popped up into the news. For example, the Laju incident where there was a terrorist attack on Singapore, and my father was the one actually helming, coordinating on the government side. So a mixture of sources, basically, personal and family, public sources, and frankly, some guesswork.
Now, in 1956, Tay Seow Huah began his career in the civil service. Just 9 years later, he was appointed director of the special branch. Now, what was his path like in those 9 years, and why was he chosen to lead the special branch in 1965?
Well, in fact, this is a good example of what we know and what we must only speculate about. You're right. The record, both in my book, but the underlying civil service, that record, he was an admin service officer in 1956, shortly after graduation. And that he had a career in different ministries, Ministry of Finance, in the Labor Commission. And then he was moved to the Harbour Board. Now, when he was there, he was the acting staff manager, handling unions, handling workers, contracts, conditions of work, training. And therefore, when I came across these known facts, and then in 1965, precisely when Singapore becomes independent, he is selected by Lee Kuan Yew personally to head the special branch. For any reader or listener who doesn't know what special branch is, it was a British legacy, but clearly already tasked with keeping the internal and, in that sense, external security of Singapore. So really quite an important intelligence and security task. So the question you have asked is exactly the question I had to extrapolate, guess at. Well, I think one of the clues is that the Harbour Board, the PSA today, or the Maritime Port Authority today, wasn't just another government installation. It was a significant, politically, economically, the hub of our harbour has constantly served Singapore, but even more so then, because in that period, Singapore had really no industrialization, no bank, not the kind of width of the economy, the breadth of the economy you see today. Support, in those days, the British thought the port is Singapore. Singapore is the port. Politically, the port was and still partly is anchored in Tanjung Pagar, the ward of Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister himself, the new Prime Minister in that sense. So, and at that time, the politics saw this sharp division between the moderates of the PAP that Lee Kuan Yew led, and how you should call them, the proto-Barisan socialists, the left-leaning, and the unions reflected this. Lee Kuan Yew had been an advisor to the staff unions of the Harbour Board, the port workers. And now as Prime Minister, he faced pressure. Can you improve their lives? Can you help them enough so that they wouldn't strike? In that period, and I note this in the book, there were actually face-to-face negotiations between young Lee Kuan Yew and the port unions. And the man seated next to Lee Kuan Yew, the only civil servant in the room, was my late father, Tay Seow Huah. So from those facts, which are in the public, if you research them through the Straits Times and other mass media of the time, you have to extrapolate. You have to guess that in that interaction, politically sensitive climate, I guess Mr. Lee and other cabinet leaders thought this young civil servant has some political nuance. He's not just another civil servant. He can read politics, he can identify. And I guess working quite close to the sensitive issue, he won a degree of trust. But I think I would say on behalf of my father, and hopefully modestly, is that Singapore those days was scrambling, right? 65 was unexpected. They didn't have the kind of resources we have today. We didn't have not just money, but the standard operating procedures. Everything was kind of new. And so I think if you look more broadly across the civil service at that time, there were a lot of young officers just sort of thrown into the deep end. Former journalists suddenly become EDB guys, or all kinds of ad hoc. And some of them succeeded, specialized, grew, become experts. Others didn't. The other point of conjecture is whether my father, even as a normal civil servant, was already slightly linked to the intelligence services. Again, I don't have any secrets up my sleeves. But if we know how intelligence agencies work around the world, this is quite common. Because otherwise, the intelligence agency is really quite cut off from the rest of the civil service. It can't get information about trade, about which businessman is doing what. So you do always have to have core, very close, and a slightly more open but confidential network across the government. And this is a point I make in the book too, that even after my father became special branch director, he wasn't always holed up in some Batman cavern. He had to go out and talk to business people, talk to other civil servants. Mr. Sim Ki Boon, for example, the head of civil service data, was at that time a PERMSEC, very much in the commerce, infrastructure, completely different field from my father. But they were good friends personally. And through that commerce lens, I'm sure there's information that's always useful for the intelligence community to gather.
Now, with the creation of the Security and Intelligence Division in 1966, what were Tay Seow Huah's priorities in building Singapore's intelligence capabilities?
So When he took over the special branch, he felt the need and discussed with other senior civil servants across political leadership to kind of specialize the special branch into two units. Overarching this, become the Security Intelligence Division and a new capability of looking externally, like our CIA or MI6. The other aspect, of course, was internal security. I try to explain this that the special branch under the British had always focused on internal security because the British, of course, had their own MI6 in London and other intelligence agencies working across Asia. Singapore didn't. It just inherited the special branch and said, let's, pardon the pun, but let's split this branch in further into two different units. My father headed both. So in some senses, the security in the name of SID originally really belongs to internal security. And the intelligence, external intelligence, really belongs to the current day, it's called SID. So the names are a bit funny, I think. But the historical names, so they've been kept. And now, of course, they're under two different ministries. In my father's time, in the first years of Singapore, under Dr. Goh Keng Swee, both Interior, Home Affairs, and Defense were under the same ministry, the MID. That tail end legacy of MID is still seen in the SAF cars. You notice their car plates are MID. So I think in those days, get on with it. Let's not over bureaucratize this. We have to cooperate anyway. So my father, in a sense, headed both external and internal. And nobody else did this until much later when Mr. Eddie Teo, who's now presently the chairman of the Council of Presidential Advisors and wrote a foreword for my book. Mr. Teo headed both agencies, by this time separated out under two different ministries. So I think the priorities were, in that sense, intelligence. Because internal security, the special branch had been doing it. He had to really recruit new people and really up the game quickly. New ways of working, new types of people, intelligences of different nature, building networks outside the country for a new country, right? I mean, not everybody knew Singapore well. Singapore wasn't a rich country. It was very difficult. More than that, the British were leaving Singapore in the overall NS story. But on the intelligence part, I think this is what I try to add in my book. The British were here to stay. They were moving their military out, but they felt, right or wrong, they know this region very well. And our region was really hot. The Vietnam War, not so far away. And of course, the tail end of the communist movements in different countries around us. There was a lot to watch about. So when I was reading and researching this section of the book, I felt as if Singapore was like the Vienna or Switzerland of Asia. Every spook was probably here. I was so lucky. I was referred to a book written about Maurice Oldfield. This name may not be so familiar in Singapore, but he was basically C. In the movies, James Bond movies, M is the head of the Secret Service, but in real life, he's called C. And Maurice Oldfield was actually posted twice in Singapore as a younger officer. In the process, got to know Lee Kuan Yew when he was in opposition. And according to his book written about him, continued to retain in touch with Lee Kuan Yew. And this meant that my father, operating Singapore's Made in Singapore Intelligence Service, had to deal with the fact that his leader had another route of information to the old British establishment. Quite a challenge, I thought, for not just my father, but his entire team.
Now, one of the most important functions that Tay Seow Huah performed was maintaining good ties with key partners such as the UK, the US, and Israel at the time. Why were these ties so crucial in the late 1960s and early 1970s?
Well, I guess first, Singapore then and even today has this almost existential concern about our security. We will always try to cooperate with our neighbors. But in the 60s particularly, there were real incidents of tension, confrontasi with Indonesia, the quite messy separation from Malaysia. And at that time, the constants of adik, abang kind of relationship, which there are some legacies of this until today. And as I mentioned, the hot Cold War in Vietnam, there was a theory, many people advocated that the domino effect that once Vietnam fell and Cambodia went into Vietnam's arms, Thailand was a frontline state. And the distance from Thailand, politically and physically, through the peninsula to Singapore isn't far. Especially when you know that various communist cells in the past they're not franchises of China or Vietnam, but the links across borders were certainly there. Indigenous movements, but networked groups across borders. And so I think the threats were really there. And with the British leaving, they had decided for their own reasons, economically, they could not sustain Singapore militarily. They had to go. That period was really post-World War II, was a tough one for the British. And I think how to fill that vacuum. Politics, like nature, abhors vacuums. So I know you've asked me how they maintained. Actually, this period was the start of Singapore's deepening relationship with the USA. The USA at that point didn't need Singapore too very much. They had Thailand. The American role in helping grow Thailand's economy, stabilize their military, and really give the military the best chance of developing Thailand in the 70s, 60s, and 70s is real. They had the huge bases in the Philippines. Again, for better or worse, American fingerprints, weight was clear there. So did they need Singapore? It is now known through more American sources than anything else that Lee Kuan Yew offered the British bases to the Americans. The Americans basically said, we don't need it because they had two other allies closer and stronger and bigger and more able to open up more resources for them to be here in the region, in Southeast Asia. So how did this tie develop? And my book talks about it. First of all, Lee Kuan Yew really led the way. He constantly engaged the Americans, and finally through Nixon, and especially in that time of Nixon's opening to China and reciprocally, found a path. And that's where that Singapore relationship with America really started. My father's life was at the beginning of this period, and he too, he took an Eisenhower Fellowship. I received mine much later. It's not hereditary, by the way. You have to kind of apply and hopefully get it. But it's a wonderful occasion to try to really understand America from the inside. He spent 6 months in those days, not so much today. My father, I think, regarded as like once in a lifetime. You had to fly. People forget. You had to fly in those days like multiple planes to get to America. Much harder than today. And America was going through a period of real ferment. The 1970s, the anti-Vietnam movement, had implications for our region, deep ones. And so my father, I think, together, of course, with Lee Kuan Yew, Dr. Goh, and all the others involved in looking at the world, started to form a worldview, which I think has put a foundation in place. We still see the world very much in this Anglo-American lens. I certainly do. Foreign policy still continues to regard the US as a key to the stability of our region. Now, you mentioned Israel. I think everyone who listens to your program will know Israel had a huge role in helping us start the army and train our first batch of NS men, etc. That's almost notorious. What I try to capture in the book is that this is also secretive and partly less known about intelligence. So I think we learned a lot from them. There are pictures of my father in the Kurdon Valley in Israel with unknown, but I think quite obviously Israeli hosts. I grew up in a house where these Mexicans, that's their code name, right, would be in the house. They were treated like friends. We would socialize with them. We understand some of the differences. And I think that's where the personal ties, the policy priorities, all these aligned. Now, I have had to think, therefore, more recently of how to think about Israel again, given what's happening with Gaza. But I would never try to escape from it that historically, Singapore owes a debt to Israel, and we should not forget it. Doesn't mean we have to excuse everything they do, but I think we can't erase history and pretend that Israel hasn't been a friend when we needed one.
Now, in 1970, Tay Seow Huah gave a speech titled War and Peace in Southeast Asia, a Singapore Perspective, at an MOE forum. You write that the speech indicated a consensus was developing among the political leadership and senior officials on key strategic and security issues. Now, what were some major takeaways from this speech you found most illuminating?
Well, that's a good question. I was very lucky to find that speech. It was given to me by a true historian, Ang Cheng Guan, who's written a series of books about our region and Singapore during the Cold War. And he, of course, I think merely footnoted it. So I don't want to overemphasize it in the history of Singapore. It's not as though my father set foreign policy for Singapore. I want to be clear about that. But I would say he was one of a very small group of civil servants and political leaders that helped shape that foundation. And this speech reflects his version of it. I'm also chuffed, quite happy that a number of people who were around at that time reflect that it was sent across the whole civil service by Lee Kuan Yew. Basically, the political masters made sure everyone had a chance to read the speech. It was also reproduced in one of the newspapers of the time. It wasn't the Straits Times, but one of the now defunct newspapers. So in this sense, it was relatively well known at that time, and it gives my father's take on the view of the world. Now, what were they? One was that he had a concern about China. I want to explain this carefully because today, China doesn't seem, views and trust of China is kind of mixed, but there are many more Singaporeans who are much more open to China, do business with China. And I certainly don't think I or my father, if he was alive, would be anti-Chinese. But the history of that time, just coming out of the various communist movements associated with China, the lack of knowledge of what's happening in China. When you hear, as intelligence people would, rumblings about the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, which wasn't a leap forward and led to a lot of, this is before Deng Xiaoping came and said, we want to open China gradually and we want to ask Singapore how it did it. So I think there was a tension question mark over China, and that to some degree, I think still continues today. We have to think hard about China, be open with our eyes, not naive, look what they do, try to understand what it means to be an independent country which has a majority of Chinese. The second was America. At that time, my father was very clear, as was Lee Kuan Yew, that America was going to quit Vietnam, going to lose and quit. Now, how do they do this though? If they leave precipitately, if they leave a vacuum, what happens? Will the Russians and the Chinese eat Southeast Asia for lunch? So how do we engage America knowing they're going to go? And if you look at it, this is not just a security issue. This became an investment, trade, business issue. When did American investments come in? America today is the largest investor in Southeast Asia, and the bulk of the investments sit here in Singapore or from Singapore, right? How did this start? And really, it's part of a geopolitical engagement of America. The region around us, again, my father writing in the first few years of ASEAN. I'm a great believer in ASEAN. I think everyone in Singapore today should be. We need to work with our neighbors, working together. We can do much more than if we try doing it on our own. But the facts of 1970 don't give you much confidence. There isn't even a Secretary General. There's no summit of ASEAN leaders. It's just the beginning of ASEAN. And at that beginning of ASEAN, it was much more about placating old problems. And some of those old problems haven't gone away. Historically, Indonesia, Malaysia, this Muslim world we live in, Singapore tends to be a bit of the odd man out, more developed, more Chinese by ethnicity or more mixed, more English speaking, non-Muslim. All these factors have continued to the day. So I think these are very important recognition. Along the way, some comments he makes seem strangely prophetic. For example, he talks about then Burma, today Myanmar, being a real problem. And I can't say he's wrong. 50 years on, we don't see a peaceful, stable, and growing neighbor in Myanmar, sadly, tragically. Things that he didn't talk about, I think also quite interesting. Whenever you examine what people say, I think you should think about what they are not saying. Japan doesn't feature very much. Perhaps for my father, is personal legacy. He would often talk to me about how he lost his father in the war. 1970 Japan too isn't the consistent partner that today we celebrate Japan. It was not the Japan that all of us love to visit on holiday. 1970 Japan is way ahead of Singapore or anybody in our region. And they acted that way. In the first chapter, when I deal with the Laju incident, the terrorists had a connection to Japan. And in that, we saw the Japanese refusing to really help Singapore by providing a plane. They only did so after allies of the terrorists who attacked Singapore captured the Japanese embassy in the Middle East and held the Japanese ambassador as a prisoner. Then they relented. So I think for various reasons, we can see that the picture he painted in the 1970s, some of them have rhymes or echoes into the present. Some of them have changed and slightly for the better. And underlying it, my father's view was that Singapore had to succeed in order to be secure. And that's where we are today. We have had a remarkable run of economic and other successes. In that period, hosting the Commonwealth heads of government was a big thing. The first time it was held outside London, and leaders of the world came to Singapore was 1971. Today, I think Singapore is really a strong convening power.
Now, perhaps the most publicly well-known incident that Tay Seow Huah was involved in was the infamous Laju incident in 1974, as you have said before. This event is more popularly associated with former President S.R. Nathan, who was SID chief then. Now, how did your father contribute to this effort?
Well, first, let me set some context. I think this was really independent Singapore's first hit by terrorists. And the hit came on the Bukom oil refinery. I know the name Laju is often associated with it because that's the name of the ferry that they tried to escape on. But when you put the word terrorist and Laju, somehow people might think that it's an attempt to steal a ferry or blow up a ferry. But really, the hit was meant to be, and explosives were used and detonated on the Bukom oil refinery that still sits there. And at that time, Dev, it was a critical facility because it provided the oil for the Vietnam War. It was then, I think still is, the largest refinery in our region. And it was a critical facility to provide that support for the American involvement in our region. Now, you mentioned a particular thing about Mr. Nathan, who was a close associate of my father. They worked together as colleagues for many years. My father worked with him even back in the Port Harbour days before either of them got to be SID director. And as we covered earlier, my father was appointed 65 as special branch and then became the SID director when he helped create the SID. So Mr. Nathan was the second director of SID. So when the Laju incident happens, my father is at that time the permanent secretary of Home Affairs, and the SID, Mr. Nathan, is under the Ministry of Defense. So when I was looking at this, I looked first and foremost at Mr. Nathan. I was very lucky. Mr. Nathan, of course, lived a very long life, a good life, and he reached out to me several times, as I record in the book. I'm grateful to him because we did occasionally talk about my father and the incident. For the book I've written, I relied mainly on Mr. Nathan's own book, where he says very clearly that my father was the one who told him about Laju. And he asked Mr. Nathan to come over and help him. My father was the one who went to the Istana, was briefed by Lee Kuan Yew and given the overall charge. When deciding who to reach out to, he reached out to Mr. Nathan, one of the earliest, perhaps the first person he reached out to. Now, as I said, my father's Public Secretary of Home Affairs, Mr. Nathan's under SID, which is under defense. Now, SID is external. So Mr. Nathan himself says, why him? Shouldn't it have been his deputy secretary or the head of ISD, internal? Because, this is an accident in Singapore. I don't know. Mr. Nathan also doesn't say. But I think it's because they had that all working relationship, that trust. When something really bad happens and you need to respond in a spotlight and yet coordinate deeply and report to Lee Kuan Yew, who would you want to have? It's people you really know have got your back. And Mr. Nathan never said that he was the main coordinator, never tried to doubt that my father was the main person. They were friends. In fact, Mr. Nathan's first book, a very small book, was dedicated to my father. Not the big one of the presidency, but the smaller one he wrote first. And now, I think that this in a way tells us about how history is told. I think we fall into the fallacy of the survivor syndrome, or the great man syndrome. That when you look at some of the television shows that were done about Laju, they interviewed Tay Seow Huah, which is fine because he was the head of Marine Police at the time. He was the man in front. And even Mr. Nathan, which is fine because he was involved. But television's format is you need a living person to talk to you. My father couldn't, obviously, unless one believed in seances. So he's kind of downplayed in that, which is a bit unfair, but I don't take it as a personal slight. It's just how these media, these historians work. The other factor is I call the great man syndrome. Mr. Nathan did become the president of our entire republic. He was a distinguished civil servant. So from this perspective, I see like a light casting backwards. The front figure cast a very large shadow even in the past. In his contemporaries, Mr. Nathan was certainly respected. But in the 1970s, when this incident happened, Mr. Nathan is one in a cohort of senior trusted civil servants. So is Mr. Bogas. So is my father. So are other civil servants. I mean, not necessarily every single servant, but a number of them were known to be quite trusted to deal with trouble and problem spots. So I think it is not Mr. Nathan's fault. And certainly, I'm not claiming my father is larger than Mr. Nathan. I'm just saying the facts and trying to understand why some websites, some documentaries suggest otherwise. So the popular idea about Laju is either we don't know anything about it, and many people sadly don't, or Mr. Nathan is the name most associated with it. In the end of the day, that time and today, the Prime Minister is in the end in charge. So if you go back to the media, it was Lee Kuan Yew who my father reported to the end of every day. It was Lee Kuan Yew who got on the phone and talked to the Japanese and talked to the North Koreans and other people to try to settle things. And it was, of course, our political leader, Lee Kuan Yew, who fronted the final analysis of what happened. My father's job under Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's direction was to do the media every day, coordinate internally, and pull a team together. And certainly, Mr. Nathan was a key figure in that incident.
When your father died at the age of 47 in 1980, you told your sister at that time you could not write about it. Decades later, in preparing this book, what struck you particularly about the life your father led?
Actually, my father died and I obviously couldn't write about it. I was too close and I was a young man, 19. Even today, in the treatment of the end of his life, I actually use a lot of the media coverage. And then I add on what my sister told me in a letter. So it's much more recent that I haven't really myself spoken about how I feel about my father's actual physical death. I mean, I've written about his life and I try my best to understand the whys, but I feel emotionally quite very difficult to deal with his physical death. And again, factually, I wasn't there in London the night before the operation. My sister was. So I've got her words. Why not use hers? She's my elder sister, and my father loved her dearly. And she, I think, even more than me, remembers and loves him. So why not use her words? So I'm happy to bring together different voices so that it's not entirely, it's a son's memoir, but it's not only my voice. The harder question then is, what do I do about my own sort of emotional relationship with a dead father? And that's why I think on a historical podcast, I think I should explain my last chapter. So if you look at the second last chapter, it's called Endings, the physical death of my father. And there's something called Coda, the last chapter of the book, where I discuss matters of past and present day with my father in a series of imagined conversations. I've spent the last chapters painting my father as real as I could, but the last coda is an imaginary discussion. It's quite, from a historical point of view, quite heretical, right? I felt good about it. In this imaginary, fictional discussions, I used real things he said in a report he wrote for the Eisenhower Fellowship about America and our region. And then I inject the fact that he's 47, the year he's dead, and I'm 47 too. That was the year I left for America for a 1-year sojourn. And I picked places and foods that I knew he liked. And we would often, when I was 19 and he was 47, sit down and have a meal together and have something like that kind of discussion. I just, as a 19-year-old, obviously didn't know or empathize as much as I could now. And so emotionally, I felt, rather than describing his death, I tried to describe this ongoing reflection. I've had a bit of a political public life too. I've never been a civil servant like my father. I was an NMP. As a student, I was a student union leader. I actually led a petition against government policy. I can tell you at that time, some of his old friends called my mother and said, does Simon know what the hell he's doing? Because my father was in charge of internal security, and there I am in the 1980s, which is quite a still under Lee Kuan Yew, Go King Swee time, for making noise and ruckus on campus. I mean, I'm not trying to overthrow the country, don't get me wrong, but Singapore those years was so quiet that we made the headlines some occasions. So I think that plus the refugee situation from the Vietnam War, things even today, what would my father have thought? I think that's what the last chapter is about. And that closes off the book for me the best I can, using the skills I have as my son, also as somebody who's researched this book, and then as a fiction writer. I'm quite happy with that chapter, though I know that some historians would say this is not on. This is a bit different from the rest of the book.